I'm Dr. Mark Gold, and this is the Gold Standard.
It's just a great pleasure to welcome my friend and colleague, Dr. Charles Nemeroff, here to the Gold Standard. Dr. Nemeroff is the Matthew P. Nemeroff Endowed Chair in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the University of Texas at Austin Dell Medical School. He's a director of the Institute for Early Life Adversity Research, co-director of the Psychedelic Research and Therapy Center, as well as a professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences. So I think I covered most of it. I couldn't cover it all without taking our valuable time, but heartfelt welcome and thank you for all you do.
Well, Mark, it's great to be with you. And I just thinking back about how many years we've known each other and all the good things we've done and had fun together. So that's, the reason I wanted to get together with you is that I only work with people I like. So looking forward to this conversation.
Well, thanks very much. So, I have just a lot of questions, but mostly they're based on just a remarkable career and talk about where you've been and where you're going, because you're one of the people that we all rely on, not as in part like where the field's going, what's evidence-based, and we should get behind it. And, just the whole academic mission. So let's just say off the top that when I looked up H indexes and tried to decide where you ranked in your career as the most or least referenced psychiatric researcher, according to my research, using Scholar GPS and using Google Scholar, you are the number one most cited psychiatric researcher in the United States.
Oh, geez. Well, thanks for letting me know that. I had no idea that's the case. But the reason that is because I don't have a lot of talent, but what I'm really good at is picking young people to work with me. And they're so incredibly productive, and I do what I can to help them, that my name goes on a lot of the work that they largely are responsible for. So I would give tribute to the wonderful young people I've had who've gone on to have amazing careers.
I appreciate that. And I've said the same thing about, like, if you looked at my papers that are the most cited, they're because they're the most cited by Nora. Or, we wrote a dopamine hypothesis paper, and then she spent her whole career on the dopamine hypothesis. But you are not only number one in psychiatry, you're number three in biological psychiatry, number three in childhood trauma, and number four in mood disorders. And that's just to show you how scary AI is these days. I'm just 13th, so
that's not shabby.
Well, thanks very much. So, just as far as like how you got here, I remember meeting you when you were looking for MD, PhD programs, and I was teaching medical neuroscience at the University of Florida, and you were looking at our new neuroscience department where Fred King came from Yerkes. I remember you interviewing and how impressed I was at that time. It stuck with me forever. You went to UNC. How did that come about?
So, a very interesting story, Mark. I don't think I've ever shared this with you. So I was working as a research assistant at McLean Hospital in the research labs there. And I was perfectly happy. I had a dog. I had a girlfriend. I was living in Brookline, and I was earning $14,000 a year, and life was good. And I was working there, learning how to do some very basic neuroscience research as a lab tech. And one day, the co-director of the lab facility was a guy named Alfred Pope, who was a neuropathologist.
Worked on blood-brain barrier.
He did. And his office called me and said, Dr. Pope would like to meet with you. And my initial thought was, I'm obviously in trouble. Why would this guy, want to meet with me? And so, I walked into his office, had a ponytail, and I was wearing an army jacket. And he was a blue book Bostonian, very prim and proper. I sat down and he said to me, I'm wondering about what your academic intentions are. And I said, I got a good job and a girlfriend and a dog, and, I'm pretty happy. And he said, the questions you're asking in the research seminars are more insightful than the faculties. And I think you ought to go on to either go to medical school or graduate school. And I said, I didn't have a great undergraduate record. I was 16 when I entered as a freshman at college, and, I wasted a lot of it. And I said, I don't know that I can get into any of those kinds of programs. Plus, how would I pay for it? He said, well, there's an evening program at Northeastern where you can get a master's. And if you do well in that, you'd be set up to go to a medical school or graduate school. And I said, wow, but how could I pay for it? And he said, I'll pay for it.
Wow.
I said, what? He said, I'll pay for it. And so I ended up getting my master's, and he was my master's thesis advisor on a blood-brain barrier project. And amazingly, he wouldn't even let me put his name on the paper. It was my very first publication. And so when I got done at the master's program, Alfred said to me, well, where do you want to go to school? And I said, well, I want to go to a place that has a PhD in neuroscience. And there were only a few places back then: Florida, North Carolina, and Urbana, Illinois. And I know I didn't want to go there. And so he ended up, this was like the old days. He called some people at each of the places. I also looked at Duke, and ended up going to UNC, where I ended up having a fabulous mentor who you knew very well, Art Prang.
Yeah.
The thyroid guy, which
Yep.
sort of brought you and me together.
Definitely. Well, that's just what a beautiful story about the old time academia. I think that might be hard for some of the trainees that watch this to understand just how helpful our mentors were. I mean, I know that's the same for me. I was a reluctant psychiatrist, and I would never have gotten to George Agajanian's lab if it wasn't for a telephone call. That's awesome. So you had at UNC, you did your PhD and MD, and then you worked with Art Prang, but also at that department had Maury Lipton.
Mark Maury was the most remarkable mentor, and he was somebody who was willing to think outside the box. And so they were a perfect combination. Art died last year at 94. He had a really good run. Maury died prematurely of colon cancer in his 70s, sort of ripped us apart. But they were both wonderful mentors.
Was it more of a general mentorship, or was it something more specific? If you think about your career in neuropsychopharmacology, it's a lot more like Maury's than your. I mean, I think of your thyroid work as important, but when I look through all your publications, which believe me, I just did, and came up with my 10 favorite, it was barely in the top 10. Your thyroid. It's important because thyroid's important in depression, and misdiagnosis is important, but just generally, you're much more of a Renaissance neuropsychopharmacologist.
I think Maury taught me to to have very broad interests and to, one of Maury's closest friends was Julie Axelrod, who was the Nobel Prize winner, and I got to know him pretty well. And there were two things he always said that stuck with me. One of them was that, you know, 99% of the important discoveries are made by 1% of the investigators. And secondly, he always said, you got to take a flyer. You got to go ahead and you're going to have some really crazy ideas. Most of them aren't going to pan out, but you need to take a chance. And, the work that I'm most proud of is the work on the consequences of childhood trauma. And when that work started, when I moved to Duke in 1983, when that work started, all of my grants and papers were rejected. And I got these reviews that, that it's preposterous that Dr. Nemeroff believes that events that occur early in life could be persistent and have long-lasting effects. I mean, every grant I wrote, I had a fateful meeting with a professor at Duke who, at the Duke Faculty Club, who said to me, "You're never going to get tenure. You got to give up this crap with early life trauma." Freud was interested in it. He realized he made mistakes. He said, "You got to study serotonin." I said, "Everybody's studying serotonin." Okay. And, but, as you know, I'm nothing if not persistent. And so, I feel like it launched an entire field, and now there are thousands and thousands of papers documenting the long-term effects of child abuse and neglect. And, child abuse and neglect is a bigger factor for longevity than smoking cigarettes every day.
That's remarkable. I mean, and your work in that area has kind of continued going to Texas. You have a whole institute there, right?
Yeah, it's, first, remarkably, the Texas legislature has been incredibly good to our department, to psychiatry in general in the state. And they started in 2019. They set up what was called the Texas Child Mental Health Consortium, which a lot of it is giving us funding to provide service in child psychiatry. Each of the 12 medical schools has a catchment area in the state. We have 8 counties that we're responsible for, and we are provided with funding from the state to hire faculty who reach out both telemedicine to the schools, consultation to primary care doctors and pediatricians, and also to hire psychiatrists to place at local mental health centers. And they've now expanded it to include perinatal psychiatry. So as part of this huge consortium, and the current biennium received a total of $347 million from the state. And part of it is a research initiative. And so I'm fortunate to be able to chair the Texas Child Trauma Research Network, in which we've collected almost 4,000 children and adolescents that have been exposed to trauma, and we're following them for 2 years to try to figure out what are the predictors of a good trajectory or bad trajectory. So, I can't say enough about the fact that the legislature has chosen child psychiatry to be their favorite stepchild.
Yeah, it's just remarkable. I mean, hard money, voting with their feet, and with a proven research champion like you, they'll get a great return on investment for sure.
It's very exciting.
Well, I mean, that's not to get into the whole psychedelic thing too before I go through your career, but Texas just did that again for psychedelics.
Well, we are, our group is one of the finalists for this very large Ibogaine project. And, I'll just take a minute, because I know you know about this, that our field lost a giant figure in psychiatry who passed away unexpectedly about 2 weeks ago, Nolan Williams, who was about to be appointed full professor at Stanford. I wrote his letter of reference. He was also looking at some other leadership opportunities. He had, in his brief career at age 42, he had pioneered both the Ibogaine TBI PTSD study, but also the accelerated theta burst TMS for treatment-resistant depression, and founded 2 companies based on these findings. I mean, he was a rocket ship of brilliance, originality, and the nicest person.
Definitely.
And, he was one of my mentees. And, I think this shocked all of us.
No, I know. I heard about it from my daughter, who was connected to him during her training. And I've been a text buddy of his. You and Alan introduced me to him, in part because I tried to help Deborah Mash when she started her Ibogaine treatment programs in the Caribbean, and intermittently have been helping her. So I always found him to be just so kind and generous, as well as self-deprecating to a fault.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. And I probably spent, 30 to 40 hours with him over the last few months. I chaired his DSMB for his NIH grant. I mean, we had a lot of interactions, and anyway, it's just a tragedy.
It's a big loss, and I wish you well on the Texas grant opportunity. And let me go back. So basically, let's put you back in UNC, and you're pioneering the trauma field, and you're not paying any attention to negative feedback. Was Dwight Evans a supervisor in an inpatient unit, or because that also connected you?
Yeah, you've got a great memory. So Dwight Evans was the assistant professor attending on the 3 South inpatient unit at UNC. And here I come as a resident to do my rotation. And we sort of became friends. I was in a softball league in Durham that played right outside of where his house was. And so every weekend, I would go over on a Saturday or Sunday and play softball, and then I'd go over to Dwight's house, where his wife, Jan, would give me a sandwich and a beer after lunch. And so we became good friends. And Dwight had been trained psychoanalytically. And after I was on the unit for about a week, I sat down with him and I said, this is a living laboratory. I said, you've got, 20 beds, whatever it was. And the length of stay, Mark, unlike today, was something like 40 days. And so I said to him, we have the opportunity to do research in thyroid function, in cortisol activity. And if you'll allow me to use your unit as a living laboratory, I'll include you on everything. I'll teach you research if you teach me clinical psychiatry. And so we developed this wonderful friendship and published a ton of papers. Following up on your thyroid work, we published the thyroid antibody papers. It was all done in that population. And then we started doing DST work, cortisol work, et cetera, et cetera. And it's also where I first realized the importance of child abuse and neglect. Because in interviewing the patients on that unit, it was so prevalent that I was gobsmacked.
Yeah. Well, it was a great partnership, and it contributed a tremendous amount to the field. And these things have just stood the test of time. your CRF work, I mean, in spinal fluid, or hypothyroidism as a misdiagnosis, or I think they're just as relevant today as they ever were. And you just, even the idea, and maybe you do have to bring in child abuse or neglect and trauma in the whole cortisol system, but those are your top, really at the top of my list of your major science. I did have neglect and abuse in there, and you link it, to this kind of dysregulation or continuous under attack, flight or flight system. Has that work, like, who would you say are the mentees that have carried that work forward?
Yeah, I think my long-term mentee and colleague is Carrie Ressler.
Uh-huh.
And, Carrie, just to tell you a little anecdote about Carrie. So Carrie, received his MD degree from Harvard and his PhD from MIT. And he comes and interviews for residency at Emory. And he's sitting in my office, and I said to him, in all due respect, we're number 10 in the country in research, but we're not Harvard and we're not Mass General. And he looked at me and he said, "No, I'm from Jackson, Mississippi, number one. And number two, I want you to be my mentor." And so he came, and, he ended up staying on the faculty and was a Howard Hughes investigator. And then after I left Emory, he relocated back to Boston and is the chief scientific officer at McLean. And he remains on all of my NIH grants. He really does a lot of the genomics in both our postmortem tissue studies and in our child abuse and neglect studies. The second would be Elizabeth Binder, who was my PhD student at Emory and is now the director of the Max Planck Institute in Munich in psychiatry, and is just a fabulous scientist. And there are many other, but those two really stand out. I mean, Jeff Newport has done phenomenal work in perinatal psychiatry. And, I recruited Andy Miller from Mount Sinai to come to Emory, and he's really been a champion of the inflammation work, which is a big part of what's emerging in pathophysiology. So, and then, of course, what can I say? Helen Mayberg, I recruited her.
Sure. That's right.
At Emory, and now she's at Mount Sinai and is the leader of deep brain stimulation work. So, yeah, I've been very fortunate.
Anytime you can convert someone who's not a psychiatrist, you made I felt that way about some of my mentees that went into addiction when they're trained in another discipline. And she's number one in my mind in deep brain stimulation. I quote her all the time, and her work is just beautiful. But I'm glad you reminded me. I forgot about Helen. So that's another one. So we have you being a mentee, you being a great mentor, you having your own publication and contribution history, and then starting so many people off. But you're also a program builder. So you built a great program at Emory. I mean, fantastic program. And then when you came to Florida, I remember saying to someone in the state government how lucky we are, because we finally have somebody that we could send patients to who have treatment resistance or who need a second opinion. And I'm not sure everybody realizes that, you love seeing patients.
I do. I absolutely do. I still see between 8 and 10 hours of patients a week. Um, and they're really focused on two separate programs. One is we, as you know, have this comprehensive diagnostic and treatment evaluation program in which patients are referred from all over the world. They're seen by me and 5 other faculty. And if needed, the chair of neurology or the chair of internal medicine. But the reason I initiated this program first at Emory, then Miami, and now here is because none of us are prescient. And complex patients require people with different levels of knowledge. So every patient gets neuropsych testing. Every patient is seen by a psychologist, 3 psychiatrists, including myself. Then we all get together, and each of those faculty present their case to me. And I include a resident who watched me do the interview because it's a good teaching experience for them. And Mark, we find, as you know, exactly what you'd expect. People that are largely misdiagnosed, diagnosed as bipolar disorder when they're really on the autism spectrum. People that are bipolar that have never been diagnosed. People that are delusional but no one ever noticed. Early dementias, and a whole bunch of medical causes of psychiatric illness. And so that's a program, and it's not on our website. We don't advertise it, because we're overwhelmed with referrals, and we maybe can see one such patient a week,
Sure.
which means about 45 a year. And then there are my patients, and I have what I call patients with tenure. These are people that I've taken care of, for 20 to 30 years. And the good news is they're mostly stable, right? And I, probably have about maybe 200 patients that I've been following. I love it. And, it's not like being a GI physician and doing colonoscopies. These relationships, I've had some of my patients as long as I've known you.
That's awesome. Yeah, no, I'm that's hopeful for people who are just coming into the field, just to realize that you can have a, robust research career and still be a great doctor.
You just sent me a referral this week.
I know that. It's a good one too.
Okay.
It's a good one too. So we miss you in Florida, of course, because there's no one to send these complex second opinions to, and this one is going to be good. We'll see. So another thing that I think is and you may not even have this on your radar, but you very early on, when ketamine was in clinical trials, you were putting together thought leaders for publications, and you called me and you said, could I review ketamine's addiction potential for your journal, which is now one of my most highly cited articles. And the point is that's before people identified ketamine use disorder. And most people wouldn't know me well enough to realize that the DEA had sent me to Southeast Asia to look at ketamine production. It's like a few cents a dose, and sexual, it's a date rape drug in Southeast Asia. And I always appreciated that, but I always felt it was a surprise, like getting a call from the White House. You wonder, like, how they know your number and where you are. It just, how Nemeroff knows that I'm thinking about this, it's remarkable. And also, I do think many psychiatrists don't appreciate how important your job is at evaluating new technologies. This kind of counsel role that you have is, could you just describe your history as that, when and working so hard for all of us to understand new technologies and new things that are being promoted out there?
So, the fact of the matter is, somewhat sadly, that we have a great unmet need in treating the major disorders that we encounter every day. And we have to be honest about it. And that's true of major depression. It's true of PTSD. It's true of addiction, substance use disorders. It's true of autism. All of these disorders, to a varying degree, have some treatments that work great for some people. And some people just don't respond. We learned this from the STAR*D trial in depression. But, in PTSD, we don't even have validated metrics of remission because we can't get anybody into remission. We just, not with the currently available psychotherapies or pharmacotherapy. So, a lot of companies, startup companies, have asked me to sort of help them. And as you know, there are tremendous advances being made now in neuromodulation. And so the next great move in neuromodulation, apart from the TMS experience, is focused ultrasound.
Sure.
And focused ultrasound can reach deep brain structures. We just published a paper in Molecular Psychiatry where we targeted the amygdala in patients with mixed depression, anxiety, and they got better when the amygdala was the focus, the target of focused ultrasound. So I'm all about the data. And, whenever a company reaches out to me and says, would you be our advisor or consultant? My first and most important question is, do you really want advice? Or you just want my name on your website as an advisor, and you're just going to do whatever you want to do, and you're going to try to detail me about your product?
So I was going to say, for the APA, you called me and said, could I chair and organize experts in cannabis and CBD? And I said, I'm 73 or 74, I forget what I was at the time, 75. Could I have somebody do it with me? And you said, sure. Who is it? It depends on who it is. And I said, with Kevin Hill. He's a mentee, and we can use him, and we'll read every single paper that's been written about cannabis and CBD, and we'll write a report and we'll present that to your group. You are the chairman of the Council on, I think, Therapeutics. Is that the name?
It's the work group on biomarkers and novel treatments.
That's it, the work group. And so we came back after a year's work and said, you're going to find this crazy, but they could get ketamine approved, but they can't get cannabis approved for anything, because apparently either it doesn't do it or they haven't been able to show it. And the same thing for CBD. I always found that very refreshing, because obviously there's a lot of people that believe it's useful, but it was still really great to work on that project with you. And it's, again, the American Journal of Psychiatry paper that summarizes it, pretty well referenced for a paper like that. And it is peculiar that we could show that no matter how hard you looked, you could hardly find any evidence that would qualify as FDA level evidence. And so
you're absolutely right, Mark. And it speaks to the issue of what's available on the internet and what people are exposed to, both clinicians and the lay public. And as you know, if you look hard enough, you're going to find what you want to find. And, this sort of obviously is related to the psychedelic era that we're in right now. And if you go on the internet, you see a lot of first-person accounts of, how psychedelics saved my life.
Right.
And whether it's microdosing or whether it's using repeated doses of one or another psychedelic. And, we have to listen to those stories. They're important stories, but they're not data. And, you and I have always said the plural of anecdote is not data. And so, believe it or not, there has never been a randomized controlled trial of a microdose of a psychedelic. This would be the easiest study to do because microdoses don't have psychedelic-like effects.
Yeah. No one ever wants to do. Yeah. I appreciate that too. I mean, I was doing a piece for Psychology Today on LSD, and you're my main expert. And so when you looked at the LSD and GAD, you were like the founder of the Anxiety Society and that meeting, I know. And so I said, well, what does Charlie think? And you said, well, this is a good study. Let's not confound that study with self-medication and anecdotes.
Yeah, no, it was a very interesting study because it was interesting for a few reasons. First, GAD would not have necessarily been the disorder I would have picked to study with a psychedelic, but it's a disabling disorder. They looked at 4 doses of LSD and placebo, and the two findings, one, there was sort of a dose response curve.
Which is
Number
excellent.
2, it was phenomenally effective and lasted for a long time. But what was amazing was the side effect profile was so benign.
Right. It called out to me because that was Agajanian's lab, and that was his original work. And when I came there, Danny Friedman and Agajanian were doing single units in the Raffe and studying LSD. So I have so much experience with this. And he always said the same thing, that if it wasn't for all of the self-medication of the Harvard experts, LSD would have been approved and we would have found a safe and effective dose. So I appreciated your insights there. But do you have any similar insights on what's going on with psilocybin?
Yeah, I think, obviously, there have been more studies, randomized controlled trials with psilocybin than with any other psychedelic. And it's largely been driven by this company called Compass. I'm not a consultant to them. We were a site for their treatment-resistant depression study. If you look at the data, all I'll say is that number one, in almost all of the studies they've conducted, psilocybin is superior to placebo in the management of treatment-resistant depression, number one. Number two, all psychedelic studies have the problem of blinding.
Sure.
And not being able to really blind the subjects or the raters is a problem. There may be ways to get around it, but I think it's a problem. Thirdly, if you look at the data, the remission rates with psilocybin were better than the low dose or placebo, but they weren't like the Saint data from Golan, right? They were better, and for TRD, remission rates of 25 to 30% is good. But we're going to have to try to figure out who are these drugs best for, in terms of personalized medicine. And the fact of the matter is, make no mistake about it, the one thing that psychedelics have done, and I think also the TMS, accelerated theta burst, it has told us the brain is capable of responding very rapidly to a treatment for depression. This is very different from when you and I were in training and we were giving tricyclics and it was taking, 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks for patients to get better. So the fact the brain can actually respond that quickly is phenomenal. And secondly, that a single treatment or maybe two will have an effect that lasts for months is a game changer. It's amazing. On the other hand, I know you know what I'm going to say. I'm concerned about the fact that you and I could fly to Portland and we could go to the mushroom store and you and I would walk in and the guy behind the counter would be the mushroom dude. He'd say, "Oh, you look like you're a 4 gram kind of guy."
Yeah.
And then he's going to weigh out these mushrooms. And of course, the content of psilocybin varies from mushroom to mushroom and strain to strain. So you don't really know what you're getting. And then you're going to take your little brown bag with your mushrooms to the therapist who is trained online. And you're going to pay that therapist $1,000 to sit in his or her office or apartment while you have a psychedelic experience without any medical screening. So I think it's a bad plan. And I also think, stepping out of what you're asking me, but the widespread availability of cannabis has had some very negative consequences.
No doubt.
As you know, Mark, I'm a big dog fan. Got 2 dogs, love my dogs. There have been more veterinary overdoses of cannabis in Colorado that have resulted in emergency room visits than you can imagine. And not to mention children.
Not to mention children. And we did cover in a recent Psychology Today article just the testing for cannabis in counties with legalization. If you look at fatalities in some of these counties, you see a disproportionate amount of drivers under the influence of cannabis. So
Absolutely.
To say it's true that it's not lethal like fentanyl, but if you count motor vehicles and now this new news about the truck drivers, it's challenging. But so I do like, you and I think so much alike. It's very interesting because I was always thinking about comparable efficacy and how unfortunate it is for TMS that they accepted the antidepressant challenge, because so many people were like you and me and said, I don't think TMS really works. But then when so they made them try TMS and treatment in antidepressant non-responders rather than do a random assignment comparable efficacy from day one, where Zarumsky has already said TMS would win. So TMS versus antidepressants with new cases would win. So we have a treatment algorithm that's upside down, probably.
No, it's interesting you say that, Mark, because one of our 4th-year residents, who's a superstar, got some funding from the state to do a TMS, accelerated theta burst TMS treatment in adolescents in their first episode.
Yeah, that's great.
Adolescents don't like medication and they don't like therapy.
Yeah, it's great.
And this should be the first-line treatment if it works.
Yeah, no, I don't know who made the algorithm, but it wasn't me. And I do appreciate what you said about treatment outcomes. In addiction, we don't have consensus on treatment outcomes. So if you think about treatment outcomes, if someone for XYZ, some people will say the treatment outcome is alive. But another person might say return to pre-morbid function. And even if you have alive, because that's all we have right now, the goal should be return to pre-morbid function. That was the discussion Nolan and I had about Ibogaine. Was okay. I mean, the current NIDA thinking is people with opioid use disorders might need to be on methadone forever. Well, I mean, I remember Vince Dole, and I remember that group very well. And Kleber had we had 300 plus people at Yale in 75 on methadone and at very high doses. And um, I think some of the psychedelics might offer hope of return to pre-morbid function.
Yeah, I think, you're interviewing me, I'm not interviewing you, but I will say I've watched the addiction field uh, having this internal debate about um, what the acceptable outcome is.
Right.
And, it has been, of course, absolute abstinence, and now that's being questioned, right?
It's probably the big shift in this field, and maybe it'll go back to your mushroom fear. So the field, so when you started at McLean, Ed Kansian was there, who was one of Alan's mentors, and always talked about addiction psychiatry, like what the person brought to the drug challenge, what was the precipitants, and what kind of psychiatric plus addiction treatment can really help. Where now we've had an emphasis on training people who are not psychiatrists in not looking at psychiatric comorbidity, in nihilism, and most of the treatments, even like this is so odd that you bring this up, but I mean, I've been dealing with this with some national authorities. Um, we have no treatment for methamphetamine. We have no treatment for cocaine. So their default is psychostimulants for life. So we're in a very confused place, and it would really help to have some treatment that reset the brain.
No, absolutely. And I think, one of my big hopes for psychedelics is actually in substance use disorder because of all the anecdotal reports. And my colleague Greg Fonzer and I have been trying to get this psychedelic alcohol use disorder study approved. And, the NIH study section is rather unkind. And
No, I mean,
so,
they approved building. You could build a bar, and they could approve drinks on demand faster than they'll approve. In the current way of thinking, and that could change under Secretary Kennedy, but up to this point, we've been mostly about harm reduction.
yep. No, absolutely. Yes. Well, you know what? This is the truth is there's never been a more exciting time in psychiatry than right now. The polygenic risk scores from larger and larger cohorts are bearing fruit. This will eventually be part of every patient's evaluation. And even though it might confer a 10 or 15 or 20% contribution to disease vulnerability, if you knew that at birth, that your patient was in the top quartile or decile for bipolar disorder or opiate use disorder or whatever, that's important information for you as a physician, but also as a parent. So I think artificial intelligence is going to be a game changer because what has really crushed us in psychiatry is people like you and I have done what we do, which is to identify a single factor that we think is important towards either treatment response or disease vulnerability or pathophysiology, and we study it, and then we publish a paper, whether it's inflammation or a particular genetic variant, et cetera. But our field is been crushed by the fact that there are hundreds and hundreds of variables that affect disease vulnerability and treatment response, each of which exerts a little effect. And we don't have the wherewithal to put that together, but AI does. So there will be, the use of machine learning to fundamentally tell us in a given patient in our office, well, this person's going to be a venlafaxine responder, or this person's going to be a psychotherapy responder, or a TMS responder. It may not happen in our lifetimes, Mark, but it's going to happen.
No, I do think, I do also think that this is the best time. It resonates with me that we can have either a TMS response in a week, or we can have an ultrasound accelerated response, or we can have a psychedelic response. Obviously, what we thought in the old days about antidepressants, we needed 6 weeks, was wrong, and that the whole catecholamine hypothesis was wrong. Maybe the medication's only role was to provoke a counter response that was therapeutic. And even that was so trial and error, it frustrated the patients. Many dropped out. And when we think about even treatment response to depression, if you include what we might think is optimal response, and then what patients rate, they're not that happy with what we're offering them. So we need to find something that's better. And I do think the idea that you could switch it, the ketamine limitations aside, the idea that you could help somebody so quickly really challenged everything we learned when we were in training.
No, you're absolutely right. Although I will say, as you know, I'm not a big fan of ketamine at all. And there was a paper just published yesterday in JAMA Psychiatry.
I saw that.
Yeah.
I saw that. I'm so glad you brought up that paper, because there have always been and should be questions about the controls that we have in our quest to get drug approval.
Yeah, the thing that was remarkable, there were two things that were remarkable. So one was, obviously, this was not a commercially sponsored study, and it was a study comparing inpatients with depression who were receiving the usual treatment, and then in addition were given regular doses of ketamine or regular doses of midazolam. And the fact of the matter is ketamine was no better than midazolam in helping with the antidepressant response, and the response was pretty meager. And so, considering that you and I have witnessed an entire cottage industry emerge in the United States of clinics that not only are giving ketamine, they're giving it for every indication known to mankind, and they're exceeding the doses that the Yale group have recommended.
Sure.
And literally, we have a clinic here in Austin, which on the website states, well, unlike other centers that give 0.5 milligrams per kilo, we give as much as 2 milligrams per kilo if necessary. Well, there's no data for that on safety.
Well, there is the name that tune. I mean, it's a game show, but it's very, very challenging, and especially for ketamine, because just this week as well, there's a low dose ketamine paper in pain relief by anesthesiologists and pain centers. So it's hope that we do better with psychedelics. I just hope that we do. I mean, the psilocybin is silly, and that's why I call it psilocybin. But it is still useful. The imaging data and how it might work, all that's, I think, Josh Siegel's work is the only thing I can rely on, really.
Well, I think there are a number of companies now that are looking at 5-HT2A agonists that are
Yeah,
not psychedelic to determine if they have a therapeutic effect. And there's a debate in the field about whether you need a quote psychedelic experience to derive benefit from the
right.
psychedelic. And this, like everything else in the psychedelic field, there is a belief that that's the case, but that's
Yeah.
not
Do you need
science.
to have do you need to have a seizure to have a beneficial effect from ECT?
Well, yeah, well, as
It's
far as I know, you do.
Yeah, it's just so interesting. But we actually showed that, and people do show that. And it's worthwhile to have continuous skepticism and say, show me with the data. And I do think we should be able to do that. It's sad about ECT, though, if you think about it. When you think about treatment resistant depression, how many would be treatment resistant after ECT?
Yeah, so there's not a lot of data about this. Um, we could talk a lot about this. So there were patients in Nolan's Saint study that had failed ECT and responded to Saint.
That's great.
So, but in terms of most clinical trials of either a device or a medication eliminate patients who are ECT failures because they view them as the ultimate non-responders. And you may know this better than I do, Mark. I can't think of a study of ECT failures.
I'd have to call Zarumsky, but he would know. When I went to
Yeah,
Wash U, everybody got. I don't think there is one,
I
but
don't think there's ever been one.
yeah, when I first went to Wash U, that everyone got ECT. They must have had 80 inpatient beds, and Chuck did the ECT. I think he still does the ECT himself
Right,
with Conway. Those guys are now
right,
using nitrous
exactly.
oxide. Yeah, yeah. But I think you're right. Um, what do you think about the toad? I mean, Mike Tyson's toad DMT
Oh,
for
the bufotenin, yeah.
yeah.
So bufotenin is a indoleamine psychedelic. It does have 5-HT2A agonist properties. There are a number of related compounds like 5-MeO-DMT, which is vaporized. And there's a company called Beckley that had a very positive trial with this compound. There are others as well. GH Pharmaceuticals just had positive results. Um, and these are robust results. You have to remember that the psychedelic studies, unlike the big pharma studies, even the best studies like Compass have 250 patients in the study, whereas big pharma would study, you know, 3 arms, 300 patients per arm, close to 1,000 patients. So, these studies are very expensive. But the data is again, it's very promising. We need to solve the blinding issue.
Sure.
And the way to solve that, in my mind, is number one, you don't allow any patients in the trial who have ever done psychedelics before, which has been a problem with some of the other studies. And then you use a comparator agent that's psychoactive but not psychedelic. And my choice would be something like dexedrine.
Mm-hmm.
So you compare a stimulant, which has clear psychoactive effects,
Mm-hmm.
to a psychedelic in patients that have never been exposed to either one.
Yeah,
That would fix the problem, but companies don't want to do that.
uh, I
Do you
think
know
in the
why they don't want to do it, Mark? They're afraid the stimulant will be effective.
well, I mean, I learned a lot from Josh Siegel's psilocybin study, and I think they used methylphenidate.
Yes, they did. That's correct.
but they weren't trying to get psilocybin approved for use. They were trying to understand the mechanism. And really, what I loved about that study was I learned a lot about methylphenidate. And you'd be right. I mean, the performance enhancing alerting effects were not limited to a ADD or ADHD diagnosis. It was across the board.
Yep. This is why a lot of college students who haven't been prescribed methylphenidate are getting it from their friends.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to understand. Well, I don't want to take your whole day, so I'll say this: it's great to catch up with you. Uh, I congratulate you on building such a great program again at the University of Texas in Austin. And you just seem to do that again and again and again. So it's no fluke. It's all about your ability as a teacher, mentor, builder, thinker, supervisor. And congratulations on a great career so far. And here's to another 20 years.
Well, Mark, Ned Kaelin and I are the two longest sitting chairs in American psychiatry. So I'm in year 35. And what I tell people, well, apparently it's the only job I can do well. So, but you've always been a great friend and colleague, and, a lot of respect from me to you in everything you've accomplished. So, being able to sit with you for an hour and talk about things that we have shared over the years meant a lot to me.
Me too. And thank you again, Dr. Charles Nemeroff, for joining us in the Gold Standard.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Charlie.